started. So if you weren't in here before when I made the announcement, can you please text extern to 37607 or go to polev.com/extern. We're going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with quick introductions. Unfortunately, one of our members was unable to be here because she's ill, Jillian Dutton. I'm Kenda Abdul-Sabor. I'm from Georgia State University College of Law.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Reeves. I'm from the University of Maine School of Law.
I'm Marjorie Silver from Truro Law Center. Should we quickly state where our roles are there?
Oh, we can.
I'm the for a year and a half now, I've been the director of our externship program after 30 some odd years of teaching.
I'm also the director and professor of our externship program, and I'm the only person who does that.
I'm a lecturer in the externship program at Georgia State, so I supervise students and teach the seminar. Okay, so I figured before we get started, we thought it would be good to get a lay of the room and see who was here and what kinds of things you are doing or have been doing. So raise your hand if you have already conducted a supervisor training with a piece on diversity and implicit bias. Okay, so a few of us. If you're planning to do so, raise your hand. You may fall in both categories. Okay, and what about those who teach diversity or implicit bias in their externship seminar? All right, so we got a little bit of everything. So since you've had, this is a material that people shy away from, right? Like people don't really want to talk about cultural awareness, diversity, implicit bias. It scares people in the audience, and sometimes it scares us, right? So thinking about that, if you can pull it up. Use one word to describe what you fear most about conducting these kinds of trainings. One word. And so in that text, you're just going to literally text that one word to that 37607 number.
Oh, so I'm texting now, am I clicking on the link that came back in the text to me?
I don't think you should know. You should just be able to text it to that number.
Yeah?
Yes.
I'm on the website and I'm not.
Doesn't seem like it's receiving responses yet.
Yesterday gave us trouble too.
Oh no. So nothing's happening when you text the number?
No, it's
not.
but it says your presenter has not opened a poll yet.
Yeah.
It might be.
Yeah, exactly.
It says you've joined Professor Abdul-Sabor's session.
Oh, now.
Okay.
Now here we go.
Oh,
Yeah.
I actually did it twice now.
Okay, that's okay.
Do I have to retype it now, you think?
Yeah, try to send it again. It's okay if it comes through twice.
Don't look at what's already out there. Look at your own work.
Silence, knowledge, inexperience, preparation or lack thereof, I'm assuming. Resistance. Okay. Intolerance, inexperience, being white, eye rolling, bros. These are the things that we think about, right? Before we get there, we always tell ourselves, we're going to have all of these issues when we start talking about this material. So what we're going to do today, and Marjorie's going to kind of give us a roadmap, is try to ease some of that fear, right? We're not going to eliminate it, unfortunately. We're not able to do that. But we think if we have certain tools in place, it'll make it easier as we encounter these topics, right, in our supervisor trainings.
Okay, so here are some of the challenges that we identified in advance, and I just went backwards. One is the teachers' concerns about lack of expertise in doing this kind of teaching, training, that we may well have placement supervisors, as we did in New York, with very diverse degrees of experience. Some of them have already done training themselves. Some have never been exposed to the term implicit bias. And that there's generally a very short period of time in which to conduct this and talk to people who do this kind of diversity and inclusion training. Frequently, these are all day long programs for these. So these are some of the challenges. So here's what we're going to do today. First, explore why should we bother doing this. We're going to start off, Kenda's going to lead us in an identity exercise. And then Rachel is going to talk about some of the demographics, describing current populations of law students, as well as those practicing lawyers. And she will also talk about and show us a video on implicit bias, the science behind implicit bias. Then, okay, if we decide to do this, how do we do this? We're going to spend a good deal of time with you focusing on learning outcomes. What are we trying to achieve? The importance of setting ground rules before we do this. And we will share with you just a sampling of exercises and then more in terms of resources that are available to you.
Okay, so what's coming around is an exercise that I actually did in a supervisor training. Get this one first. That I did in the supervisor training. Now, the first piece I did not do in the supervisor training, but I do it in my class. And so what's coming out, so first you have a handout that has a list on one side of 1 to 10, and on the other side it has a pie chart. Unfortunately, we're not going to have enough time to go through the whole thing, but I do want to go through the first step. And what you're doing in this handout is thinking about your cultural background and how you identify culturally, okay? I think it's slowly coming around. Yes, he's going to keep going. So what I want you to do on that left side, right, there's the numbers of 1 to 10, okay? And what you're going to do is describe yourself culturally, right? So for each of those numbers, put how you identify culturally. Not necessarily how other people see you, but how you see yourself, okay? What would be the way that you describe yourself culturally? What are your cultural characteristics? They're not in any particular order, but just put them on there from 1 to 10, okay? If you don't have 10, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, just 2.
Now, as you finish listing those, you take a little bit of time to really think about it, right? It may be something that you've never thought about before. And after you get finished listing those, what you'll do is the second handout, which is on each sticky note, you'll put your 3 most salient characteristics. So on the pink would be your most important characteristic, cultural characteristic, the blue your second, and the yellow your third. And that's not to rush you, but just so you have everything.
Important to us.
Yes, important to you. Important to you and how you see yourself.
Right. You know it is.
Awesome. take your time, but as you finish, you just hold them up. Because we're gonna, and I put your name on it, of course, but just hold up, we're gonna take those up. The sticky note sheet, not them. Well, whatever you listed here, you just put it on there.
By the way, there are no right
Chapter.
answers. Okay.
Sure.
Marsha, let's catch you up to speed.
Yeah, the first time I did this, I found it difficult to think about how to do
We have time, but when we, completed these, hold up your hands and I'm happy to go.
Okay, once we're done, then what do we do?
If you have your top three, you can give them to me.
What do I think the top three? The top three
Yeah,
on here?
so in order.
In order.
Yep, 1, 2, 3.
I see mine.
I know,
They need a big like warning.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want an extra one too.
We'll give you extra ones.
How do you use this idea? You gotta give me another one.
What, the sticky note?
No,
If I didn't love you.
I'm here to get teaching tools, come on.
Yeah, a little resistance to being a student.
Okay, now I'll do it.
Thank you.
Need this one.
That's just the wrong order.
Oh,
You have like a-
no, I think you said.
No, I gave her the.
See, that's what I want.
Oh, I see.
I would have liked to.
Okay, well, that's not that
If you comply with the rest of our
meeting.
story.
Right, and we have active participation for the rest of the session, if we might give
Anybody
you
else?
those things.
I did put defensiveness
really
on
is.
my,
It's shallow.
Is everyone finished? Have we gotten everyone? Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I've heard a few grumblings while it was going on, saying, I don't really know what to write, or I don't know what, I've never really thought about this. Can we just spend a little bit of time on why? Why is that the case? Why was it difficult, if it was difficult? Yeah.
I felt really shallow. On the one hand, I like to think of myself as inclusive and wanting to do what's right and understand people and be part of this inclusive world. And then I started writing down the ways that I perceive my cultural identity, and I thought, oh my God, I'm one-dimensional. It was
Okay.
very uncomfortable.
Okay, is it because maybe you haven't really thought about yourself in these complex ways, maybe?
No, I think it's because, I don't mean to be ageist about this, but I think, the older that I'm getting, the more that I'm truly becoming more one-dimensional.
I actually had the opposite challenge. So I identify as a Chicana with an X, which includes my indigeneity, and I identify as a Chicana also includes my sense of social justice and activism. So I had the it was hard to unpack because I see myself as all things at all time, although I can, I have double consciousness and I do different things, but I had
Okay, yes.
So I arrived late, my apologies, so I didn't really read the instructions, and I actually felt like it was a very narrow world that I had to work in. And I felt like it didn't really describe me.
Okay.
And then I read the instruction, it was like, wait a second, it's like, it involves a lot more, and I think I'm that a lot more, but I felt like this, my understanding, from giving it a very short look, made me feel very narrow, and I didn't like that.
I wasn't sure what cultural was for me. I mean, a lot of the things I thought of were personality traits or experiences. I wasn't sure whether they were cultural.
I almost entirely belong in the dominant culture of almost every category, and we don't think of that as culture, right? So it's hard to place that.
And so these exercises, and I use these in my class, and I also use it in supervisor training, right? Like it gives insight into how complicated culture really is, right? Like we all see ourselves in very different ways. You may look at me and see one thing. I may see myself completely differently than the way that you look at me. And so this exercise kind of gets people thinking, right? Like what is culture? What does it mean? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to other people? And from that, we then move on and we start thinking about, okay, if I see myself, this is so complicated for me to define who I am, and I am me, right? I'm living my life. If I can't figure out who I am, or if I have difficulty articulating that, how can I have this expectation that I can look at someone else, right, and figure out who they are? And so that's why we start with that exercise, because for those people who don't think about culture, right, we're different. We're different, we have different experiences. For me, this exercise isn't difficult because I think about culture all the time. I think about the space that I walk in all the time. And that's probably because I walk in a lot of minority spaces, right? So for me, this exercise is easy, but I think it's very helpful for people who don't think about it. And it's helpful for me as well. But it's helpful for people who don't think about those things to really begin thinking about them, right? Well, what does culture mean to me as someone who may walk in a majority space? And I recognize, right, and for me, even recognizing that I do walk in some spaces that are not quote-unquote minority, right? So then we put them on the board. And when we put them on the board, we realize how different we are in this room. And what Marjorie is doing is kind of stacking those that fall in the same category together. So imperfectly, right? So nobody put the exact same thing for their first characteristic. There were, I think, there were three female or women. Parent, mother, mom, there's another female. But for the most part, there's variation, right? And that's the same for the second category, and that's the same for the third category. So depending on the size of the supervisor training, we will go through this step and kind of illustrate that. Sometimes they're way too big to do this step, so we just have that conversation, saying, it's very likely that as you listed and as you described yourself, that it was, so much variation in the room. And then we kind of get to this second point. And someone asked me, like, what do you mean by cultural characteristics? Because this is like, we often talk about the big ones, right? Race or religion or gender. But the way that we see ourselves and the way we see the things that we're interested in and the communities and the groups that we partake in, it's not just those things. And so the idea is that you think about culture broadly, while also not minimizing the impact that those particular identifiers have on culture and a person's existence and their experiences in their lives. And so there's this question of what's the difference between culture and identity. So I have all these cultures that I may subscribe to, but that I may actually conflict with certain aspects of those cultures or what's traditionally been associated with those cultures. So there's the idea that the way that I identify my identity is more individualized, and culture is more of this broad concept. And so I like to bring that to the forefront when we're thinking about these supervisor trainings, when we're thinking about teaching this kind of material, so that it personalizes it, right? Like, oftentimes culture is thought of as something other people have, as opposed to something that we all in some way, shape, or form consist or walk in, right? The space that we all walk in. And so that's just to give you an idea of the framework, right? Why is this important? It's important because we all have cultural backgrounds, we all have different experiences, and it's important that we all value those everyone else, right? Take to the next step. It's important for supervising attorneys because they're interacting with our students from different cultural backgrounds. And it's important for them to understand, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but it's important for them to understand their cultural lens, right? That their students have a different cultural lens, their students have different cultural experiences, and those things are going to come into the forefront as they're externing and as they're at their field placement. Yeah.
So we thought it would be important to talk about what role implicit bias might play in what happens happens with the demographics of law schools and students versus lawyer populations. So here's some information about admitted applicants, and there's a little, you can look at this, we'll post this on the conference website, a little disclaimer about how we've calculated all other race and ethnicities. But I looked at the admitted applicants for fall 2014 because we also have data about the national lawyer population in 2017. And I thought it was worth highlighting the difference between what that group of students, what their population in law schools looks like for them, compared to what their lawyer populations looks like for them when they exit law school in 2017. And you can note the distinctions. And I think it's really important for supervisors to understand that there is a difference between what our law student populations look like and then what our lawyer population looks like. And I thought it was interesting to make some comparisons to whether we're making progress in terms of our lawyer populations. And so this information is from the American Bar Association. And you'll note that over a 10-year period, there is a consistent change. It just happens to be very small, 5% in either direction over a 10-year period. So will we make progress? Looking at law school enrollment for 2017, you'll note that I think 2016 was the first year that women took the majority in terms of law school population. And minorities have, from the data I've looked at over the last several years, hovered right around 30-ish%. And it's important to talk with your supervisors, I think, about that law school populations look like this, but then the actual lawyer population, for example, for minorities, is about half that. So what's happening between law school and law practice? So what do we do about it? And I think that's where we're at. What will the demographics look like in 2020 for this group of law school enrollment in 2017? What will it look like beyond that? And what role might implicit bias play in our progress? And so for many of you who use this information in your courses, even if you haven't taught this to supervisors yet, you know that there's a lot of data about what roles implicit bias might play in every decision in the law, of course, but also in employment and in hiring, and then even when people are there in assessment. So it's important to understand the science behind implicit bias. So the TED Talk that I use to introduce this subject matter with my students is one by Jerry Kang. Is anyone familiar with that? Are most of you familiar with that? Okay. So we're going to play most of that TED Talk, and I think it's useful to see the science behind it, and we have the time to do it. So we're going to play that just to give a little bit more framework for what we do in the next part of the session, if I can figure out how to do it.
Just click the link.
You make it sound so easy. Sound okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm going to start with an intolerant question. Do you discriminate on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation? I mean, if you're the identical TED Talk but coming from a white guy, would you like it better? Of course not. Why would you do that? We all remember the dream. We remember what Martin Luther King Jr. taught us, right? So we're supposed to judge people on their character, not the color of skin. You judge people only on the merits and nothing else. We're colorblind. But are you so sure? So it turns out actually some people actually are literally colorblind, so they can't see that tile A is much darker than tile B, but most of us actually can see that. It's actually an illusion. Just like a smartphone camera does autofocus and autocorrect, it turns out our brains do the same thing constantly. And when we do so, we usually get things right, but sometimes the shadows and the compensation for actual contrast effects gets things wrong. It's this understanding that maybe our brains are like our powerful smartphone cameras. It can actually tell us a lot about how things actually work. So think about it. The real world confronts you at a brutal pace in real time. You can't but engage in automatic processing. When I came out on stage, what did your brains do? You autofocused on my face, you did some face recognition, and you immediately hashtagged me with multiple categories. Male, middle-aged, professional, Asian. And you store that data in a mental cloud that you keep up here with all the other things that you have stored and hashtagization over the course of your entire lives. Now, social psychologists would describe that mental cloud in terms of attitudes and stereotypes. Attitudes are like gut feelings, emotional valences of positive versus negative, like versus dislike, hot versus not, thumbs up versus thumbs down. Contrast stereotypes are like traits that you associate with categories. So you already know I'm a professional, I'm a law professor. Once you put me into the category of Asian, you might be thinking, more likely than not that you got a perfect score on this math SAT. I'm Asian. More likely than not that I have a second-degree black belt in some ancient East Asian martial arts. More likely than not that I was raised by a tiger mom who forced me to practice, not cello, but violin 6 hours a day, such that I performed at Carnegie Hall at the age of 16. Two of those three are actually true. Decades of research have told us that actually these attitudes and these stereotypes influence how you see and how you behave. So if I want to know whether you discriminate, I actually have to get access to that mental cloud. I have to know what the junk is inside your head. Now, one way to do that is for me to just side up to you and ask, like, on average, sir, are African Americans more violent and criminal than white folks? On average, ma'am, do you think that women just aren't as good as a man in engineering and science, whether they be 12-year-olds or 40-year-olds? On average, do you think Asians are really good at technically copying things but lack the creativity that we really so desperately desire in a context such as this? When I ask these further impolite questions, I run into two veils. First, even if you have attitudes and stereotypes that you're aware of, you're not going to tell me what you really think, especially when the cameras are rolling. Like, how many beers must you have drunk before noon before you actually tell me what you think? More disturbing is that you might have implicit biases and mental associations that you're not even aware of. These filters that come from culture day in and day out. And if you're not even aware of them, you're not able to self-report even to yourselves, much less others. And there's decades again of social psychological research that says, in a weird way, our brains are such ridiculously complex machines that we can't just introspect and figure out what's really going on. As Timothy Wilton says, we are strangers to ourselves. So, how then do we measure these implicit biases that we might not even be aware of? Do we put you under hypnosis? Do we put you under an fMRI and take brain scans? What about something simple, like playing a video game? In order to understand, I need you to participate. The rules are very, very easy. All you have to do is run down columns 1, 2, and 3, and as quickly as possible, ignore the letters, shout out the colors. So for column number 1, you say green, red, purple, green. I need all of you to participate.
You should do this. You should do this.
Go. Green, red, purple, green.
Blue, yellow, red, green, yellow, red.
It's a 10 audience. I assume you'll be a little bit better. Okay, second time. Here we go. Ignore the letters, focus only on the colors. Ready, set, go.
Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, blue, red, green.
Oh yeah, you're screaming. So third time should be the charm. Now I want you to focus only on the colors. Be blind to the letters as if Martin Luther King Jr. implored you to do it. Ready, set, go.
Green, red, purple, blue, yellow, purple, red, green, yellow,
Essays in the winter, January, right? So now you get it. Now you see it. The whole point is that any two concepts that are tightly associated in our brains, we can actually pair together very quickly. So when you see the word RED and the color red, you can sort them very quickly together. By contrast, when you see the word RED and the color green, we hesitate. It's like our CPUs are thrashing about trying to get the right answer. We're not stupid. We've got admitted as participants in the TED Talk. We should be doing this faster, but it takes a little bit longer. But that's the insight, right? That you use the speed of sorting as a signal for how tight things are mentally associated in this cloud that we don't have access to. That is the underlying logic of the implicit association test invented by Tony Greenwald. And you sit in front of a computer and play essentially a video game. Your flash, for example, on the standard black-white attitudinal IAT, pictures of white folks, white men, picture with your left hand. If you see a picture of a black man, you with your right hand. You think that? It's actually easy.
How
And
many
you
of
see
you have
sometimes
taken the
good words
test?
like beauty and joy. Hit a key with your left hand. By contrast, when you see words like filth and sick, bad words, hit a key with your right hand. You can follow these instructions. Notice the actual arrangement. White faces and good words are in the same response key. Black faces and bad words are in the same response key. And we fly through that test. But because psychologists are devious people, sometimes randomizing counterbalance, you get runs like this, where you get white faces and bad words on the same hand, and black faces and good words on the same hand. And then we hesitate, we stutter, we make a few more errors, we go a little bit more slowly. It's that delta in time that by definition is deemed to be a measure of your bias. That if you measure, it might be only 300 milliseconds, it might only be 200 milliseconds. But that's the test that was created. Now, if this test is just nonsense, whether you're left-handed or right-handed, or you grew up playing Nintendo versus Xbox, what would you see if you gave this test to a lot of people? Well, you would see random noise, like a coin flip, right? Half the people would score good words with white faces faster all the time, faster than black faces. It would just be 50-50. So think about what data has been collected. So you actually have this amazing site, Project Implicit, run by Brian Nozick, Marjorie Benalji, and Quinn Greenwald, both Professor Benalji and Greenwald I've had the great pleasure of collaborating with. They collected millions of IEP scores, and here's what we see. It's not 50-50. 80% of us associate good words faster with pictures of young people versus old people. 68% white over black, 68% straight over gay, 69% thin over fat, 76% able over disabled, and 72% of us are faster to sort pictures of weapons with black male faces versus white male faces. It's not random. Moreover, these implicit biases seem to be strong. You could measure people's explicit biases. You go up there and ask them survey questions, and they can answer anonymously. When they do, they show some preference in the ways that you would predict, of young over old, white over black, and so on. But when you look at the implicit biases, actually expressed in the same standard statistical units, you see implicit biases as being stronger. It's as if explicitly we can hear the wisdom of Martin Luther King, but implicitly, not so much. We want to be colorblind, but maybe Nietzsche was right. There is no immaculate perception. But do milliseconds really matter, as my friend Dolly Tripp has asked? But I've shown you that there's all this evidence about time, 300 milliseconds, but we don't really care about time, we care about behavior. Because behavior change is a function of this. This is precisely what we wanted to ask and answer. So for example, if you had to put on headphones and listen to a lawyer's cross-examination, would you judge the lawyer differently as a function of whether you thought the lawyer was white versus Asian? Of course not. We're the bottom line warning, right? And we all remember the dream. But that's what we wanted to ask and answer. So my colleagues, John Gasupta, Kumar Viswaran, as well as Gary Glazy, actually brought in a lot of people up at UCLA, mostly white. We, of course, measured their explicit bias. So we give them survey questions and ask them, on average, right, how eloquent do you think the white American litigator is? Eloquent, assertive, persuasive. We ask the exact same questions about Asian American litigators. Guess what the results are? Surprise, surprise, no average difference. We all remember the dream. But we don't want to stop there. We also want to measure their implicit biases. And it turns out even though there's no average difference in explicit survey results, there is a difference in speed. We're faster to sort white faces with litigated words than Asian faces with litigated words. So we see some difference. But of course, all that we really care about is actual behavior. They heard these cross-examinations. They were tricked into thinking that one was done by an Asian person, one was done by a white person. The way we tricked them was just to flash a 5-second picture of the Asian attorney or the white attorney and change the last name on the transcript that they read along with. The results were really interesting. Some good news and bad news. So the good news is that the implicit bias, this kind of little reaction time, didn't seem to have an impact on how they evaluated the Asian attorney. But when it came to the white attorney, it did have an impact. The higher the bias, the higher the evaluations. So to give you some concrete sense, imagine someone like Philip who has 0 implicit bias. This is what he would have given the white attorney as a score on a 7-point scale on confidence, likability, hireability. But imagine someone else like Matthew who's in the 93rd percentile of bias. He would have given these scores. is much higher on a 7-point scale. Even if Matthew has no explicit bias, his implicit bias, as measured by the silly little video game, implicitly moved him. He was moved by what I call the rightness of whiteness. There's an impact. Our study emphasizes and gives more evidence to the belief that these implicit biases actually alter our behavior. And scientists have said and found that implicit biases influence the way that we get called back for resumes, how awkward my body language is viewed, whether we hire men over women in the laboratory, whether we cut minorities from their budgets or not, how doctors actually recommend treatments for heart attacks, the speed of shooting blacks versus whites in a video simulation, and even cops' use of force out in the field as correlated.
So why do our supervisors need to understand this? From a supervising training perspective, why is it important that they understand it?
The kind of work and the amount of work that they'll give the different students if they have multiple externs there, and even the expectation of what they're going to get back and the type of feedback that they're also giving students.
Because in addition to that, the time they give their externs, just if they're giving more time to externs that look or seem to be more like them, and which would cause the other externs to feel like disenfranchised at that placement.
So I think in most of the field supervisors I deal with, assume they are biased. Again, and I think that how fine-tuned that is a question, but I think that that's their working assumption if you ask them to say yes, correct. So there's a question about how you put it into practice, the awareness of bias. Anyway, implicit or explicit, you have it, you're aware that you have it, then what's that next step? How do we train for the next step?
And I think that's part of what we talked about in our call is understanding what who your audience is. Whether they're supervisors who are intuiting that, because I think that in my experience with people, for the most part, they think that they're not biased. Has been my own personal experience. Even, they just think of themselves in that way because they think, oh, I'm a lawyer and I understand the role of, equality and fairness. And so my experience, I think, is generally the reverse, even if not ill-intentioned.
I would think that also supervisors need to know this to understand how the students might be reacting to clients who they're dealing with for the first time, whether issues of poverty, it may be, the students may be, the clients of a more diverse group that the students may typically interact with. So I would think that it's not just for how they deal, what they're understanding about this, the students, but also the students' reactions. Their reaction to the students, but the students' reaction.
Yes, absolutely. Helping the student to navigate that as an effective supervisor. Great.
So you don't want to.
I think that's sufficient. Yeah, I think that's a good spot for Preston.
Yeah, okay. So thinking about, you kind of touched on this, like knowing that some of my supervising attorneys or most of my supervising attorneys already acknowledge they have bias, like how do I approach that? So what we're gonna do now is do a little bit of brainstorming. So we're gonna break into 3 groups, okay? You can self-select your group. The first group is for those people who would plan supervising trainings for attorneys they think are in the very beginning of the spectrum, right? Who may or may not acknowledge they have bias, may not necessarily really understand the whole implicit bias, the implications of implicit bias in its existence, right? That would be the first group. So you will be planning the learning outcomes for that type of training, okay? The second group is for those people who are a little bit further along the spectrum. If you feel that your supervising attorneys understand that bias exists but don't really know how to limit its implications, right? That's group 2, learning outcomes for that. And then group 3 is really for those people who are all the way along, right? They acknowledge they have bias, they have some tools, but they're trying to take it even a step further and really know how to have effective conversations with their student externs about the bias that exists and to train their student externs dealing with situations that are cross-cultural interactions or experiences, okay? So group 1 is at the beginning, group 2 is in the middle, and group 3 is on the other end. And what you will do as a group is come up with learning outcomes for supervisor training for that particular audience. Does that make sense? Yes, okay, so we can have group 1 over here, group 2 kind of in the back, and then group 3 over here.
Hazard. Have another word that I'm not expecting. Hi, are you in the beginning group? Yeah. How about you? Beginners?
Yes.
Anyone saying group 3?
I am.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I did that.
But if they move it over, move it over, maybe.
I guess maybe surprised that, he's the one. Maybe, I mean, it's not like I had these conversations with her about what, you know, for instance, yeah, but it was to present it to her, probably not to be. But it was, one of my colleagues, does research and scholarship in this area, and it was the comparison of the two memos. He talked about the differentiation is what this was about Asian and African American memo. So the exact same memo, and they had a hypothetical character. It was the same concept. Yeah, you're right, that one, yeah, it is, yes, versus African American. And that is as well as operations. It's a hard. That being said, the biggest one of our.
You know, I wasn't sure.
Check this, check this.
How about language to be
So it's constantly identified.
Oh, was it right on there? Yeah, I was just taking notes here.
Maybe we should write a list.
Oh, and then.
Find and addressing.
like, I think it's like a journey, but I don't know, I'm worried about not being able to.
That's what I think, that I don't think
No, that's not a. The fact that you can identify that, you check the resume, that has some say, that understanding that you can have, and want to
But I'm learning
This is supervisors and how they react to students with bias, as opposed to them, what I raised, and teaching the students about implicit bias that they might have towards clients, right? Is that the supervisor,
That's
right,
the
you
only point
might
why resume.
students differently.
I was kind of surprised that the supervisor could talk to the students about different kinds of clients that they interact with. Maybe it's I guess their culture was bad.
It's more than just learning right, so understand, yeah.
Science, association, everybody.
what's it learning out? Right, whether it's student or supervisor learning out.
To make the students aware
Recognize this by using signs.
Because I think there's, as a teacher, and you use it on the body, you have to get up.
And I said, because it is about advice and parents, we're not going to
The same for some of the
So the learning outcome is
Right, but I think that's
I was just so tired, I was short on time, I was like, oh, if I take care of my Saturday for goodness sake. And this is, that's why it's so Are you going to run through my line and the ability to identify your fields and recognize when they're 7 7 was the time.
Right.
I don't know, if I were that, I would like that. If we were like getting up and then getting back over to top. I mean, that's like, so, yeah, I don't know. I think so.
Wearing language as
That's a walk on. That's sufficient.
Maybe they didn't think of
Yeah.
How to get there, like you're saying. Okay. So there we go. What are the
It's kind of that.
for me to talk to them about it. It's not there in practice, they're trying to and hope that they will start to internalize it. And I don't have to say, you do.
Yeah. It's pretty
You just gotta do it. You're like, just do it.
Is that inability to articulate?
Let's take about 2 or 3 more minutes to wrap it up.
No, I don't think I think it's
Identifying examples of how bias manifests in
it relates to
So if you think we should have like a basic where people live in safe neighborhoods,
examples of how bias
yeah, but we could do it
But cultural awareness assumes if cultural competence that you're constantly working, there's no such thing as competence itself. So you can check with the music bias and the action of trying to do it. So understanding. Well,
Are we supposed to look
Let's bring it back in. I'm so glad to see you having so much discussion. Let's bring it back in. Thank you. All right, let's see what we came up with. Let's start with group 109. If you can just give, yeah, okay, that's great. Is you all ready for us to take care? Okay. So we can have one person to just give us a quick quick summary of what you all came up with? Do you need this, or is it okay if I take it over here?
You can go over there to read it.
I bet it'll be the same for everybody, right? Beginning to
Number one on our,
Unfortunately, our.
red is number one.
Okay.
Okay, so one of you want to debrief that? That's what happens. You stand out. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, it's the exact same thing. Each group.
I know, work by yourself and excluding the rest of us.
We call it the packet before. Don't put it with me.
I did that yesterday in my presentation. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Quiet down. Quiet down now. It's class time.
Okay, this was group one at the very beginning of the spectrum. What did you
Yes,
all?
thinking about a training for the supervising attorneys, we came up with 4 somewhat blurrily defined learning outcomes. We'd like our supervising attorneys to show that they're aware of what implicit bias is and maybe be able to articulate its existence. We thought maybe we could get to them in a stealth fashion and not be very confrontational, talking about how it is in practice, maybe with their clients, and they might think about, well, I have biases myself, or we could say, articulate it, how it comes up in practice, and any biases of your own. We'd like our supervisors to acquire the language and comfort level necessary to discuss the topic, to be able to define what it is, and identify examples of bias that could manifest in the relationship between student and supervisor.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. Group 2A. We'll start with the dietary.
So, we talked about the fact that we would want our learning outcome to be, and we were dealing with a group where we had people who think they're woke and that they're very aware. And then we had other people who were woke and, are working on and engaging in this stuff on an ongoing basis. So I loved the analogy of that engaging with your implicit bias or reflecting on it is not a finite line. There's no finish line. That's why there's like the finish line is like there's an X through it. It's actually, it winds and you change and you might come across those biases again later on in life and or find new ones that it delves and it's messy. And so using dentist, it's like going to the dentist. You have to keep up, you gotta get to keep cleaning every 6 months. You use the dental floss. You kind of get something that's stuck in the back.
When I teach this to students, there's a great snippet from Jay Smooth in his TED Talk where and I just literally used a minute where he says like, bias is not like taking your tonsils out, like once I'm done, I've been trained, I'm all good. He's like, it's much more like dental hygiene, where every day you have to do the work, and new little things get stuck, and so then you gotta keep flossing and toothbrushing. And so I just said it is a really good analogy.
What was the TED Talk?
It's Jay Smooth, it's his TED Talk at Hampshire College. His blog is Ill Doctrine, and so he's got some good pieces there, but this one, it's like around 8:30 or something. It's like, I don't know, 8 or 9 minutes into the talk.
Thank you. Group 2.
We don't hold this up for you, group 2.
Oh,
Somewhere good to see you.
Sorry.
Can you read it, or do you remember what you wrote?
Yeah.
You want me to bring it back up to you?
No. I mean, you can. I'm going to say, I don't even feel confident that, I can't sure what we were talking about. I think we were really struggling. That would be, please correct me if I'm, to come up with what an outcome would be and also articulate the idea of it. Anyway, so the first one says identifying places or occasions where and when bias might have an impact. So you're open to the possibility that bias is there and trying to figure out where that might come into play. And then the other one, the next one is Oh, so that led to, well, strategies, and we thought, well, what if we can identify places where we might encounter bias and they might make an impact, what can we do about it? And the first idea was trying to adopt blind, whatever that says, hiring practices, for instance, like a sanitized resume, but then we had a discussion about whether that's even feasible or desirable. And then, so we just had a couple other ideas that came up out of so trying to identify or understand your impulse or the feeling of bias to be able to determine when you're maybe influenced was one. Start me off on the next one.
A buddy check.
What?
A buddy check.
Okay, buddy check, yes. So then there was the question of whether it would be a good strategy to check in with people at a different perspective from you to see if they could help you detect bias that you yourself might not be aware of. And we had quite a good discussion about that and whether that would work or not work for lots of reasons, given the assumptions about somebody taking you as a white person, taking your decision to a black person and expecting that they will be able to represent what bias looks like, white person. And then the last one, techniques for helping develop techniques for overcoming or balancing. It's not over. Countering, right? So one strategy is eliminate all the information that you have on which bias might be based. So that's kind of the blind hiring. This idea was to acknowledge your bias and get to know, figure out how you can get to know people that you're working with in a way that you're not as subject to making stereotypical assumptions about them based on what you observe. Thank you. You thought it was really hard, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
We made it hard.
Well, it was hard, yes.
Okay, so we had group 3, the Wilkes group, and our sort of sub goal was also to possibly talk to faculty members or maybe the clinical faculty members at our school also, who I also think have issues with this, but the awareness, but maybe not the facility. So those same kinds of groups. So one is the idea of being comfortable with discomfort. If we could, bring people to the point where it's okay for them to feel uncomfortable, which from supervisor, your teaching role is difficult to bring people there, but these are goals. 2, awareness of how they/we may still be bringing our biases to or bringing them upon others, like our supervisees or our students, okay, we know what's going on, but how is that still manifesting itself in our interactions? To let people know how that can still happen. There are really good documents on this, and then 3, knowledge of the vocabulary to have these discussions. So, okay, maybe an intro level would be the phrase white supremacist culture. Have we ever heard that? What goes into that, et cetera? And then the kind of master's level is how do we use that in order to facilitate these discussions? Because it's real hard to have a discussion about anything you don't know the vocabulary with. As an example, exactly. And so, and if you could work toward facility with that vocabulary, you can really elevate the people who already kind of know into people who are actually good at this kind of stuff. So those are
Just going to the vocabulary aspect of it, I mean, race and gender are differences that are frequently discussed, and we might now, have more vocabulary regarding those differences, but there are other differences that, that are not as often talked about, like, for example, I'm struggling with the right use of pronouns, and I'm part of the newly appointed Diversity and Inclusion Committee at my law school, and this year we've been working on, just trying to come up with raising awareness and build programming, and even, an innocuous email went out with the wrong pronoun that, which I had no awareness about, but even learning about the different kinds of differences and coming up to speed on those things too. You know, that's.
So of course, in our, I think it was like 10 minutes, we're not able to come up with the solutions, right? But what we passed around was some learning outcomes that we came up with while we were preparing for this session. On that spectrum, right? Beginning, middle, and end. And we're not going to really go over it, but I just wanted you all to have that as, you know, a starting point, something that can hopefully be helpful as you begin planning or continue planning your supervisory training. And so now what we wanted to spend a small piece of time on was just going over some things that we have used in supervising training. And for me, I'm literally just going to run through the list of what my supervising and training consisted of. Of course, somebody wants to ask me more detail, but I don't have time to go into it as much as I would like. So for us, I'm at Georgia State. We had a supervisor training, Georgia State, Emory, Mercer, UGA, and John Marshall together hosted a CLE training. We had about an hour and a half for the implicit bias diversity piece. And what we did in our hour and a half, our learning outcome was we had a spectrum of people, and it was about 90 people or so, so we weren't going to have very much time for discussion. We weren't really have very much time to really get into the weeds, right? So what we did before the session was send out the implicit association test and encourage them to take it. We really don't know, of course, how many people actually took it, but for that to be a framer of the conversation, we talked science, and we started with the exercise that I did with you all today with the sticky notes, to frame the culture versus identity conversation. We then did not this TED Talk, we used another TED Talk on implicit bias done by, her name is slipping my mind. We let that play for about 5 minutes. We talked about the science behind implicit bias and why, like what actually happens, right? Like why we are biased in that way. And then we kind of opened it for very little discussion. We didn't have very much time, but to talk about how it applies to supervising students and why this is important to supervising students. We also integrated statistics and things like that into the presentation, but that's just a general overview of what we did. We got very, very positive feedback. We were told by the supervisor and trainers that this is something that's never really addressed. We don't really know what to do with it. This is a really good starting point. And I think for our audience, most of them were at the beginning. Like most of them have never had this conversation. So that was my experience in Atlanta.
Did you direct them to take a particular IIT?
Yes, we directed them. I'm glad you asked that. We directed them to take the race, IAT, and gender, I believe. Yeah.
So first of all, I had proposed, I had sent out something for the externship way back when, saying anybody interested in doing something about training supervisors in diversity, inclusion, and implicit bias out of pure self-interest, because the New York Area Consortium had decided we were doing this, and we do our training in January. I've never done it before, but I've done it in my classroom. It was go great in my classroom. So I want to talk about what the process and what we ended up doing, and some of why I ended up feeling a little bit icky about it. And I'm so glad that I've learned from all these people. One thing I want to say is that the subgroup, I think there were 4 of us, had endless conference calls discussing all the various things we could be doing. And I found it hard to say, okay, let's figure out exactly what our goals are. We only had 1 hour to do this. And we were 4 white women, which caused me a great deal of racial anxiety about doing it to a very diverse audience. We soon decided that we could really use some help from someone with some expertise. I won't go into all the details, but first had a woman who's done a lot of this, who's African American, and then had to drop out close to the last minute because she got a political appointment, but recommended someone she had worked with, Rachel Godso, who is now at Newark and is part of a whole institute doing this kind of work. And Rachel was amazing. So Rachel did a good overview of this whole thing. But we really wanted a big segment of this to be in the workshop form. because we knew out there in our audience in New York, mostly people from New York City, there was going to be a lot of expertise. So we decided to use hypotheticals, and what was just passed out to you was, I felt strongly that we should give a choice to the groups as to what hypothetical they wanted to work on. And one of them, as you can see, the first one has to do with potential implicit bias of the student, and the second one has to do with potential implicit, maybe explicit bias or assumptions that the supervisor made, not based on race or gender, but rather based on being differently abled. And we throw those out as examples of the kind of things that you might want to do. I mean, what we just observed here was how incredibly involved all of you were in the conversation. And we had the same experience with the hypotheticals in that this audience, I think we had about 140 people who broke up into groups of 4 or 5. And the conversation was incredibly rich and went on for quite some time. And then it came time to debrief. And first of all, what we learned is we didn't use nearly enough time for debriefing. We never got to the second hypothetical and the debriefing. Again, we only had an hour. You had an hour and a half and didn't even do a breakout then. So time was certainly a factor in this. But then the discussion also got derailed at a certain point. We started to go through the questions about whether implicit bias might have been operating here in any way. And a gentleman raised his hand and said, well, if you've had a chance to look at them, let me just pull it up too. Just refer to, here's the one, underline. So in this one, Jason was working in legal services and employment law unit, and he was assigned to collect more facts from this woman who alleges employment discrimination on the basis of race. And he comes back to his supervisor and basically says, I don't think there's a case here because she didn't, she really didn't say anything that showed that this was a race-based firing. And he also said clients seemed to get frustrated with his questions. At any rate, this gentleman raises his hand and says, well, I don't know, I think, that he might have been absolutely right, that there was no employment discrimination here. And then I see a couple of other hands shoot up, and I assume they're going to disagree with him. But instead, someone else says, I think what's wrong here is that the supervisor should never have let him go interview the client without the supervisor being present. And I was like, ah! And we got back on track, but I was left feeling icky that this had derailed. So, if Jill were here, and she's really sorry she couldn't make it, the piece that Jill would add is that what happened is Jill, just a couple of weeks ago, went for some training specifically about how to have these discussions about, mostly I think it was about race. And she said, based on this book, actually I can, yeah, okay. So based on this book by Hollins and Govan, and Rachel's going to talk about the resources very soon, about using norms to facilitate difficult conversations. So whether you call them norms or you call them ground rules, these might well help so that things don't get derailed. I mean, we didn't have problems with people getting nasty to one another, which could happen. But certainly, if I were to do this, or when I did this again, the idea of setting certain ground rules so that it is a civil conversation, that people can understand they're going to feel discomfort and be okay with feeling discomfort, and the importance of listening for understanding. All of these things would have been useful to have done in advance. So this is yet more tips for digging deeper. the slides, by the way, from the whole conference are going to be online, so I'm not going through these. Because, but I will go back, I can leave them up. Because what we want to do now, and we're delighted that we still have almost 15 minutes.
No, we're at.
No, it doesn't go to 11:45?
11. No, we're standing in the way of lunch, right? No.
Oh, shoot, I'm so sorry. All right, talk quickly about
So I
resources.
just in 1 second, in addition to the slides, we'll also post a resource list with a lot of the tools that each of us have used and do use, and so other TED Talks that Tina mentioned, another one that Jill uses, and many of these things that we have talked about in our presentation, so we hope that you will find that useful. And
Where is that?
we'll post that to the conference website with our materials.
As well as this.
Yeah.
And I would just say really quickly as one last little tidbit, I think group 2A said it very well. This is an ongoing process. It's very, in group 3, so it's very uncomfortable for your audience, but also sometimes for you. Please embrace that discomfort and don't allow that to be a reason that you don't do this very important work. Because if you don't have the conversations, then we're just going to stay in the same place, right? So we are tasked with the uncomfortable position of moving the needle, right, and pushing people forward. Carmia, I just wanted to add something, I think.
I just think the request for us, as people that want to do this work, to consider language and definitions, and to get away from the phrase women and minorities. We don't say whites and men, so please do not cut me out of your sentence. If you want, it's either please just say white women and minorities, or you can talk about women and men of color, for example, or minorities include so many different groups, so it's not just race-based. But if you're talking about white women, like, please own that and don't cut other people out of language, because we are wordsmiths by definition. That's what we do. And so we're lazy in our speech. We're teaching our students to be less than descriptive in how they talk about important issues.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Can we look at how people identify themselves?
Yes.